I'm Catherine, and this past about 18 months actually, I have been doing some research on the college admissions process, specifically the way you construct a resume or the way we view a resume and how that plays into our admissions. So, a little bit of theoretical background. This work is really rooted in the work of a French sociologist who studied the French education system named Pierre Bourdieu. And the theory that I found so fascinating that I applied to my research was his theory of the forms of capital. So he said that in addition to economic capital, which is our accumulated and inherited wealth, we have three other forms of capital that sort of serve to maintain our position in society. So those are social capital, which is our social network, and it's both who we know and how we exploit those connections to get ahead for personal gain, for professional gain. And then symbolic capital, which is prestige. It's having, Boston University on your degree when you graduate. It's that name recognition. And then cultural capital, which is really the centerpiece of my study. It has to do with your taste, and a lot of it is looked at as this sort of spectrum. So do you have high cultural capital? Do you really understand classical music, for example? Or do you have what Bourdieu would consider low cultural capital? Are you a fan of, say, rap music or pop music in lieu of, the classical genre? So moving on, now that we've got a little bit of the definitions out of the way, this study focused on the difference in cultural capital levels when we look at first-generation students and multi-generation students. And by first-generation students here, I'm referring to students who are the first in their family to attend college. So not necessarily first generation as in coming from a different country, but first generation as in no one else has taken that leap yet. So I asked two questions. I was really interested in taking an approach that looked at this question of college acceptance both qualitatively and quantitatively, which was very new. This is something that has not been done in this literature before. So from the quantitative side of this research, I asked the question whether or not multi-generation or first-generation students give preference to other students as an applicant who display a higher level of cultural capital. Qualitatively, I was interested in whether multi-generation or first-generation students are better able to see and, really importantly, describe these markers of cultural capital and to recognize that this inherent advantage exists within possession of this cultural capital. So here I have two resumes that I constructed. My actual methodology used 5, but just for the sake of simplicity, we're going to look at 2 here today. So sorry, they're not showing up especially well. But these are resumes that I constructed that have very specific markers of cultural capital. So on the left here, I don't know if you can read this, but it's a resume for a student named Matthew. And Matthew attended a public high school. He worked at Target, he had a newspaper route, and he was not particularly involved in activities at his school. Sarah Johnson, on the other hand, attended a very prestigious private school. You can see on the right, she has internship experience, she has volunteer experience, she's got a whole slew of activities that she participated in within her school. And if you were looking at these 2 resumes, for example, as opposed to the 5, I would ask you to say which student you think got in and which student you think was rejected, and I would ask you to explain your thought process. Why did one student get in over the other? And I was looking for markers of cultural capital. I was looking for you to recognize things like internship experience versus working as a cashier. I was looking for you to pick up on that private school versus public school difference. So the first thing I did quantitatively was measure who my first-gen and multi-gen students thought would get in from these 5 resumes. So the 5 student resumes, you can see the names listed here. We had Leanne, Matthew, Daisy, Sarah, and James. And the results were not what I was expecting. I was expecting to find a difference, that first-generation students maybe would not be as aware of these cultural capital markers, and that was not the case. They pretty consistently came to the same conclusions. What was really interesting, however, was that when you look at the qualitative data, it's very different. So they came to the same conclusions, but they arrived there very differently. So there were 4 specific areas of interest that I'm going to walk you through that when you take a qualitative approach, the multi-generation students picked up on a lot of the subtle markers that I was looking for students to pick up on. And the first-generation students maybe recognized them, maybe didn't, but were not able to explain their reasoning to me. The first is socioeconomic status assessment. So we touched on this a little bit when I started talking about how Matthew works as a target cashier. So something like that indicates that perhaps Matthew is from a lower socioeconomic status than some of my other participants who did not work. That's demonstrated here. I asked all of my student interview participants to tell me if they were going to rank these 5 resumes in terms of the socioeconomic status of the applicants that these resumes depict, who did they think was the lowest socioeconomic status. Only 3 of my first-gen participants were confident that it was Matthew. 10 of my multi-generation participants said confidently Matthew is from the lowest socioeconomic background. Opposite, conversely, I asked who was the wealthiest. 8, so about half of my first-generation students, told me Sarah and Daisy were the wealthiest. 14 out of 16 of my multi-generation students said that Sarah and Daisy were the 2 wealthiest students. Sarah and Daisy, since you haven't had the luxury of seeing all the resumes, were the 2 students who attended private high schools. 6 of my first-gen students who I interviewed were not able to rank these resumes at all. They did not feel confident that they had enough information to do this. And that was really significant because every single multi-generation student felt that a resume gave them enough indicators that they could determine socioeconomic status. Here I have one of my interview, a little clip from one of my multi-generation students that you can read if you'd like. But essentially, she's saying that private high school is a really good indicator of class. Next, I looked at employment status. Again, we've started to touch upon this a little bit when we talked about target employment. 3 of my interview participants had job experience listed on, of my resumes, had job experience listed. 1 worked at Trader Joe's, 1 at Olive Garden, and 1 at Target. What I was looking for here was for my interview participants to recognize that while some students needed to have a job during high school, they worked 2 jobs, it was probably a financial necessity for their family. 2 of my applicants did not need to work, and I was looking for them to recognize the advantage of having an internship available to you. So again, this is probably the longest clip, but I thought that it really, really exemplified well the way that a multi-generation student was approaching this issue. I had a multi-generation student who told me Matthew did not use his target experience to his full advantage. If an admissions counselor had seen that he worked maybe 30 hours a week, that would demonstrate that this was probably something that he needed to do, that this was not fun money, that this was a financial necessity for his family, and that by not doing that, he disadvantaged himself because an admissions counselor could not draw that conclusion without more information. This is something that the first-generation students did not seem to realize. Next, we looked at geographical location. So I had interview participants who recognized, for example, that Leanne, coming from a county high school, probably had fewer resources available to her than a student who attended a public high school in a more metropolitan area. And finally, we looked at cultural capital. Here we see students who I interviewed picking up on the really subtle markers, the students who participated on the tennis team, who could afford the more expensive sports, the club sports. We see, again, the reference to private school attendance, all of these little markers that really make a resume stand out, but also indicate a higher class. I drew 2 conclusions primarily from this research. The first is in terms of methodology, and it's that methodology matters, essentially. You cannot take a qualitative or quantitative approach to this question of college admissions. You're not going to get the full picture. You need to look at it from both angles to understand that while students might be able to get into a university, obviously there were first-generation students here for me to interview, they are at an inherent disadvantaged position coming from this first-generation status. There's something missing from their education that's making it more difficult for them to get here, to break through that glass ceiling. I also recognized that this disadvantage is very real. That, first of all, we're not recognizing it, but second of all, it exists, and that itself needs to be addressed. So thank you very much for listening. I think we have time for a few questions. All right, yeah, I'll start with my mom or I'll get in trouble.
How do you hope that this research will change how things are done in the future?
I hope that it'll force people to recognize that this disadvantage exists and that it's something that we need to work towards remedying. We need to provide more opportunities for first-gen students, hopefully in the form of a workshop, something like that that's not super costly, but would make a huge difference if we could just explain to them how to use these resume cues to make themselves appear like a more well-rounded student. Yeah.
I'm curious, you framed this in terms of a sort of problem or issue concerning admissions.
Mm-hmm.
Did you look at any data concerning the people in admissions offices who make these decisions? How many of them were first-generation college students or multi-generation in their background?
That's fascinating. Yeah, I did not look at their backgrounds. I had hoped to speak to BU admissions counselors, but I found them kind of resistant to working with me on this research, which was really unfortunate because they're some of the people that I'm hoping this research will help in the future to sort of see what's going on. Yeah, Professor Delheim.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is fascinating. It's also really complicated because, there are, the label first generation student can cover some very, very different situations. You can have a student who is from an economically disadvantaged background or from a very modest background who's had access to good public schools and to a variety of stream programs within that school, and who's had a degree of cultural exposure. Mm-hmm. You can also have students who might be under the same label, who come from really deprived backgrounds, economically problematic families, and a lot of deprivation. So I'm not as sure as you are that the economic disadvantage and the cultural capital always conflict. If you look at it historically in terms of the experience of different immigrant groups in this country and their very different situations, I think you will see that the picture is more complicated. That's the first thing.
Well, it definitely is more complicated, and I know my sample size is pretty small. It's only 31, but I actually did break this particular sample down by economic class, and only 2 students jumped from the first gen group to a different group when I did break it down economically. They all fell within the lower 60% of income brackets as of the 2014 census.
I think that's interesting. Just one other thing in terms of admissions. I'm the last person to defend the way admissions operates, and I don't mean here. It's a very complicated story and it's problematic. But there are separate categories in BU admissions and admissions across the country in which one of the priorities is actually to attract first-generation students. Some schools do it very, very well. Amherst, which is not only a fine liberal arts college, and this counts, a very wealthy one, has been extraordinarily successful in attracting first-generation students and also in providing programs for them, so that when students arrive and they really have what you would call, and Bourdieu calls, a low degree of cultural capital, They are given an extensive kind of immersion. Because one of the problems that takes place is when admissions tries to bring in groups to increase diversity. If this is done in a simply check off the box way without actually being aware of the fact that students from these groups sometimes have real deficiencies in their education which are beyond their control, then you have problems. So, but there are some places which have been very successful and aware of doing it. And while there is such a thing as affirmative action for the rich, that is to say legacies, which we know are one of the rife problems in admissions. There's a lot of attention in most places to diversifying the population, as there should be.
Yeah, I agree. That sort of was beyond the scope of this particular presentation. I was focused exclusively on this transition from high school to college, the way the admissions process works, but I think that's a really important next step is what happens when the students get to this institution, when they do break through that barrier. How are we helping them to make sure that in the future they'll be able to continue to break down some of these barriers that are in place? All right, we're out of time. Thank you very much.